Welcome to an inspiring and exciting story about a lonely orphan and a wish-granting fairy. Stay tuned until the end to find out what happens. Once upon a time, in a not-so-distant past, there lived an orphan boy named Wahid. His parents had passed away when he was 6 years old, leaving him neither money nor inheritance, except for a small, sparsely furnished cottage. Some kind-hearted villagers took pity on the orphan child and would bring him food and drink as their means allowed, so he wouldn't feel the harshness of his loss and deprivation. When the orphan child grew into a strong-bodied and wise young man, he stopped accepting help from the villagers and began seeking work to support himself. However, there were no job opportunities in the small village where he lived. The limited farmland was owned by people who didn't need help, and the nearby river, which flowed sparsely, didn't yield much fish, so the fishermen didn't need assistance. The only way for Wahid to earn a living was to work as a porter in the distant village market, which took place at the end of each week. Every morning, Wahid would wake up early, leave his cottage, and walk to the market, reaching it after 2 hours. At the market, he would offer his services to shopkeepers or merchants, who would hire him to move their goods from wooden carts to their shops or vice versa at the end of the market day. His wages were modest, barely enough to feed him for 2 or 3 days, and he endured hunger for the rest of the week until the next market day. Despite the harshness of life and his hunger, Wahid never complained to anyone, as he had a noble spirit and a generous soul. When distant neighbors or passers-by would ask him how he was, Wahid would conceal his hunger and thirst, replying, "I am in the best of conditions." Sometimes, an old man or a poor woman would seek refuge in his cottage during scorching days or cold nights, asking for food and warmth. Wahid would never hesitate to share his food and bedding if he had any. During holidays, he would stay in his cottage, avoiding the village streets so that no one would see him in his old clothes, which he had not changed for a long time due to his limited resources. Wahid had one beautiful hobby: his love for drawing and his skill in it. In his free time, he would amuse himself by drawing on the walls of his cottage or on nearby rocks and hills. He drew amazing and unique images, such as knights riding horses adorned with silver saddles and gold and ivory decorations, large elegant houses, ladies dressed in the finest silk from India or China, or luxurious carriages drawn by thoroughbred horses loaded with goods from far-off lands. His drawings were extraordinary and beautiful. Unfortunately, they couldn't feed him or quench his thirst, nor provide him with clothing, though this didn't sadden Wahid. He lived contentedly with his situation until the following winter arrived. That winter was unusual, unlike any the village had seen in many years. It was bitterly cold, with torrential rains flooding every inch of the village, followed by heavy snowfall that blanketed the ground, treetops, and roofs in a thick layer of snow. The temperature dropped well below freezing. Wahid felt a bone-chilling cold and shivered uncontrollably. He had no firewood to light a fire in his cottage, which had no fireplace, and his tattered clothes were inadequate against the severe cold. The piercing cold arrows of frost penetrated the boy's bones, almost causing him to freeze. The situation worsened due to the many gaps and holes in the roof of his old cottage, allowing the torrential rain to pour through and drench his clothes. Wahid's condition was dire that winter, but he endured, telling himself, "And when I go to the market at the end of the week and earn my wages, I will buy a new coat to protect myself from the cold and patch up the roof holes to stop the rain." He suffered a terrible night until the next day arrived. Leaving his cottage, he headed for the market. The sky was still pouring rain, and the paths were filled with mud and water puddles. All the village houses had shut their doors and windows, and no one ventured out to avoid the heavy rain and biting cold. Wahid didn't meet a soul on his way to the distant market. Despite the arduous journey, he pressed on, desperate for money to buy a new coat and food, for he hadn't eaten in days. His disappointment was severe when he arrived at the market and found it deserted, devoid of sellers, buyers, goods, or cart owners needing help. The heavy rain and intense cold had kept everyone inside their warm homes. Wahid felt profound sadness and despair, thinking, "Oh, what should I do now?" With no other choice, he returned to his cottage through the harsh cold and challenging path. Exhausted, cold, and starving, he nearly wept from his suffering. He prayed to God for relief. Suddenly, Wahid remembered he had a very wealthy uncle living in a distant city, a prominent merchant with 5 sons, his cousins, whom he had never met. Hope rekindled in Wahid's heart, and he thought, how could I forget my uncle? I will go to him immediately. Surely, he will pity me, his nephew. He will invite me to his bountiful table, feed me, clothe me, and treat me like one of his own. Without delay, Wahid left his cottage for the distant city, arriving after many hours, his limbs frozen and stiff from the cold. He endured the severe cold with the hope of warmth and food at his uncle's house. On the way, he met a passerby and asked for directions to his uncle's house. The man, with a disapproving wave, replied, If you are seeking food, drink, or shelter from that man, I advise against it. He is a miserly man, unloved by anyone and unapproachable due to his stinginess. Wahid insisted, he is my uncle. He will feed me, clothe me, and let me warm myself in his grand house. Please, tell me where he lives. The man pointed to a distant mansion, saying, That is your uncle's house. I hope you are not disappointed. Wahid hurried to the indicated mansion, a grand palace occupying a vast area, with several floors, adorned with silver carvings and marble statues on the exterior, surrounded by an expansive garden filled with fruit trees. Overjoyed, Wahid thought, my uncle is indeed very rich. His mansion shows his great wealth. Thank God I remembered him in time to seek his help. He knocked loudly on the large wooden door, but there was no response. He knocked again, shivering from the cold. After a short while, an angry man appeared at one of the windows, wrapped in wool, and asked sharply, What do you want, you annoying beggar, in such cold weather? Eagerly, Wahid replied, recognizing his uncle, I am Wahid, your nephew. Don't you recognize me? The uncle scrutinized Wahid suspiciously, but soon recognized him. Though he did not want to reveal his knowledge of him, he asked in a gruff voice, And what do you want, you who claim to be my nephew? Wahid, trembling, replied, I seek some food and a bit of warmth, uncle. Please open the doors quickly, for I am nearly frozen outside. The uncle shouted angrily, You insolent beggar, do you expect me to descend into this frigid weather to grant you food and warmth? And on top of that, you claim to be my nephew? Go away, or I will call the king's guards to seize you and hang you by your legs above my palace gate, to let the crows feast on your flesh and peck out your eyes. From behind the uncle appeared his 5 children, each holding a snowball, hurling them at Wahid's face and shouting, Away, away, you insolent beggar, you who have come coveting our food, drink, and the warmth of our palace, claiming to be our cousin. The uncle slammed the window shut in Wahid's face. Tears welled up in Wahid's eyes, and he cried out bitterly, O cruel uncle, you and your 5 children. He sorrowfully made his way through the city's streets back to his distant village cottage. Night fell, the rain increased, and the cold became more intense, turning the air to frost. Wahid could no longer hold back his tears and began to weep like a child, blaming himself for seeking refuge with his cousins who had labeled him an insolent beggar, and his uncle who had threatened to call the guards to arrest him as a despicable thief and hang him above the palace gate. He sought shelter from the rain under some withered shrubs. The cold had stripped them of their leaves, leaving only bare branches. He crouched beneath them, shivering violently, as the shrubs provided no protection from the cold or rain. He began to sob, saying, How miserable I am, how wretched my life is. When will I find relief from this endless torment and suffering? As soon as Wahid uttered these words, a brilliant light suddenly illuminated the darkness around him. Shielding his eyes with his hand, he looked towards the dazzling light. A few steps away, in the cold, dark expanse, appeared a radiant, luminous figure surrounded by a halo of light. The figure had a transparent body and a serene, fair face with gentle features, belonging to a delicate lady whose eyes showed sadness as she spoke. Why are you crying, young man? Wahid replied painfully through his tears, I am a lonely, orphaned wretch, having suffered greatly in this harsh life, unable to stop my tears as I endure hunger, thirst, and cold. Then he asked her, But who are you, kind lady? The lady replied, I am the fairy of good wishes. Ask for what you wish, my child, and it will be granted by the grace of God. Wahid, more astonished than ever, couldn't believe what he heard and asked, are you a real fairy? Can you fulfill all my desires and wishes in life?" The fairy replied, "Yes, my child. You have suffered much, and therefore all your wishes will come true on one condition. You must not misuse them, for good wishes come true only for good people, after they make an earnest effort to achieve them." The good fairy disappeared after saying this, leaving Wahid stunned, thinking what he had seen was an illusion, and exclaimed, "Oh, where did you go, kind fairy? You didn't tell me how to make my wishes come true." But the good fairy did not appear or respond. He told himself, "What I saw must have been real, and the one who spoke to me was the fairy of good wishes. I will ask for what I have always desired, and the good fairy will grant it. That is what she promised me." He stood up immediately, regaining his energy and vitality, and shouted loudly, "A kind fairy, I wish for luxurious clothes to protect me from this cold and a carriage with 6 fine horses to take me back to my village, so that I do not wade through the muddy roads." He waited, but none of his wishes came true. He told himself anxiously, "It seems that what I wished for was beyond the fairy's power. I will settle for asking for less. What I want now is food and drink to satisfy my hunger and thirst." But even this request was not fulfilled. Wahid's eyes filled with tears once more, and he said to himself, "Oh well, I will settle for the very least. I wish for a fire to warm me from this biting cold." But no fire ignited around him, and he continued to feel the biting cold. He said to himself sorrowfully, "I must have been dreaming or imagining. The good wish fairy was undoubtedly an illusion." He turned back to his hut, his sorrow growing exponentially. As soon as Wahid entered his hut, he lay down on his bed, soaked from the water dripping from the roof, and fell asleep despite his intense hunger and cold. Wahid woke the next morning, nearly frozen, and with hunger gnawing painfully at his stomach. He left his bed, trying to ignore his hunger and cold, and glanced outside. He saw that the rainwater had turned to ice due to the extreme cold, and the sky was now raining small snowballs, nearly blocking the entrance of the hut. He said to himself with dismay, "There is no point in leaving the hut to search for work, food, or firewood to warm myself. I will stay in my hut, for it is better than venturing out into this freezing weather." He thought of passing the time by drawing to distract himself from his hunger and cold. He brought a pencil and stood thinking about what to draw, and said to himself, "I will draw a large fireplace burning with firewood, perhaps that will bring some warmth to my limbs." He began to draw the fireplace on the wall of the hut, making it large with plenty of firewood. He depicted a blazing fire with high flames. As soon as Wahid finished drawing the fireplace, it actually ignited, and the flames rose high. Wahid stepped back in fear, unable to believe his eyes. His lines and drawings had suddenly turned into reality, and the fireplace he had drawn became a real one filled with warmth and fire. Wahid exclaimed in disbelief, "This is astonishing, as if I am dreaming." He extended his hands towards the fire, doubtful of what he saw, but the fire burned him, confirming it was real. He felt immense joy and approached the fire to warm himself until the cold left him entirely. Then he anxiously wondered, "If I draw food, will the drawing become real, and will I get the food I desire?" Quickly, he began to draw a ripe apple, and as soon as he finished, it turned into a real delicious apple. Wahid rejoiced immensely and started drawing pots of meat, roast chicken, fried fish, loaves of bread, and various fruits. Everything he drew became real. Wahid began eating the food before him happily until he was completely satisfied. For the first time, he felt warmth, fullness, and quenching of thirst. Wahid remembered the fairy he encountered yesterday, whom he thought was a dream, and realized she was indeed a real fairy. She had meant that good wishes only come true through good deeds by using his talent for drawing to obtain what he desired. He exclaimed, "Thank you, God, and you, kind fairy, thank you 1,000 times. You have brought happiness to my heart. I will have everything I ever wished for in my life that I never had before." He began drawing various clothes, woolen, silk, and others adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones. All of them turned into real clothes, piling up in the corner of the hut. Wahid wore the finest ones after discarding his tattered rags, appearing like a prince or a minister. Wahid said to himself, Now I will draw plenty of money, an endless supply. I will become the wealthiest person." He started sketching on the floor and walls of the hut, drawing gold and silver coins, pearls, and precious jewels. They all turned real, glittering in the fire's flames. Wahid clapped his hands in overwhelming joy and exclaimed, "I will become rich, possessing limitless gold, silver, and jewels, more than anyone ever had." The room filled with money, jewels, and clothes. Wahid thought to himself, "The hut has become too cramped with its contents, and from now on, I cannot live in a shabby hut with such wealth. I must live in a spacious, luxurious palace in the city because the rich always prefer living in cities. Now to find a way to transport me to the city without any trouble." He went outside and began drawing in the snow, sketching a magnificent carriage adorned with gold, drawn by 6 horses with silver saddles, driven by a coachman in ornate clothes. As soon as he finished, the carriage with its horses and coachman became real. The horses neighed on the snow in front of the hut, energized and eager to move, while the coachman struggled to control them. Wahid thought of transferring the money, jewels, and clothes from his hut to the carriage, but then said to himself, "Why should I tire myself by transferring them when I can possess such items 1,000 times over simply by drawing them with my pen once I reach the city?" Wahid boarded the luxurious carriage and ordered the coachman to take him to the city. The coachman whipped the horses, and the carriage sped towards the city as if on a flying carpet. Within an hour, Wahid had a grand and spacious palace with 1,000 rooms, 50 halls, and gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. The palace was adorned with countless decorations, engravings, curtains, and chandeliers, and its vaults were filled with precious jewels, gold, and rubies. The palace also featured a stable for over 500 noble horses, managed by 50 coachmen and grooms, as well as a vast barn with tens of thousands of cattle, sheep, and cows. The palace had expansive gardens and was staffed by 1,000 servants and 100 chefs. Naturally, the owner of this magnificent palace, more splendid and grand than the king's, was Wahid. Everything he drew became reality, making him unrivaled in wealth. People from the city and neighboring towns flocked to see the beautiful palace with its exquisite engravings, marble walls, and golden ceilings. The palace and its owner became the talk of the town, with people wondering how it was built so quickly and deciding that its owner must be extraordinarily wealthy, even richer than the king himself. News of the palace and its owner reached everywhere, including the king. Wahid enjoyed all the luxuries of his vast wealth, and since his vaults and palace rooms were filled with treasures, he stopped drawing. He lived in ease and joy, and eventually, Wahid thought of marriage. Given his immense wealth, he grew proud and thought, "There is no girl in this city or anywhere in the world wealthy enough to be my wife except the king's daughter. I have heard she is very beautiful, wise, and has been named the Princess of Radiance. I will travel to her at once to ask for her hand, and she will surely agree when she sees my great wealth." He drew on the ground a caravan of 1,000 horses carrying loads of gold, rubies, and pearls, more than the king's vast treasuries could hold. Wearing his finest clothes adorned with diamonds, rubies, and coral, Wahid set out for the king's palace with his grand caravan. When he arrived at the palace, he requested an audience with the king. Bowing respectfully before the king, Wahid said, "I have come to offer you my loyalty and obedience, and I bring a modest gift of 1,000 horses laden with vast amounts of gold and jewels for our great king and his daughter, the Princess of Radiance." The king was overjoyed by the splendid gifts and said to Wahid, "Only great kings can offer such gifts. I have heard of your immense wealth, your abundant treasures, and your magnificent palace." Wahid replied, "They are all at the disposal of my lord the king, given willingly." The king said, "It seems you have a request that brought you here. Ask, and it shall be granted immediately." Wahid said, "I aspire to be related to you, my lord the king, by marrying the Princess of Radiance." The king's face lit up with joy, and he said, "I can find no one wealthier than you to marry my daughter, the princess. But I must ask her first." He summoned the Princess of Radiance. When she appeared, Wahid was mesmerized by her beauty and grace. The king whispered Wahid's request and the gifts he had brought to his daughter. The Princess of Radiance turned to Wahid and asked in a melodious voice, "I have heard of your great wealth, young man. From where did you acquire all this wealth, and what is your occupation?" Wahid was taken aback. Wahid was taken aback by the princess's question, but he composed himself and lied, "I inherited this wealth. My work is to enjoy it and spend it. For someone as wealthy as I cannot engage in any other work." The princess's face showed displeasure as she responded, "So you have no merit or effort in acquiring your wealth. A person whose only work is to spend money is not suitable to be the princess's husband." She bowed to her father in respect and left the room. Wahid was stunned by the princess's rejection, and his face darkened with anger and frustration. He thought, How can the princess refuse all this wealth? She wants me to engage in some lowly work. Is work more valuable than all this money?" The king, saddened, said, "You heard her response, my son. I wish to be related to you, but I cannot force my daughter into a marriage she does not want. Take your gifts and jewels back, young man, for I cannot accept them now that my daughter has refused you." Wahid left the palace, feeling defeated and realizing that all his wealth could not win him the princess's hand. He returned to his palace, seething with anger over the rejection. His anger grew, and he began to mistreat everyone he encountered in the city, yelling at them until they feared him and avoided him. When a drought struck the neighboring farms the following summer due to the dried-up river and lack of rain, Wahid refused to open his vast granaries to lend the farmers some wheat, barley, or corn to sustain themselves, their children, and their livestock. He harshly drove them away, thinking, "I was once a hungry, miserable person in my hut, and no one took pity on me or helped me." He could have drawn hills of grains on the ground to give to the starving farmers, but he did not. Even the farmers from his village who had come to the city seeking food or drink due to the drought were turned away by Wahid. He had forgotten their past kindness to him as a child and denied them food and money. He thought, "I am rich now, very rich, and I need no one. These farmers should be punished for not giving me their bread, food, or fire during the cold nights I spent in my hut before the fairy of good wishes visited me." The villagers, unable to recognize him in his fine clothes, jewels, and new appearance, left saddened and hungry. One day, Wahid was passing by his uncle's palace in his golden carriage drawn by 10 horses. He remembered how his uncle and cousins had treated him when he sought food and shelter from them, and how they had driven him away and insulted him. Immediately, Wahid returned to his home, filled with a burning desire for revenge against his uncle and cousins. He drew on his palace walls enormous clouds, destructive storms, and fierce winds, commanding them in anger to attack his uncle's palace, demolish its walls, tear down its structures, uproot its gardens, kill its livestock, and leave the palace in ruins, rendering his uncle and his family homeless and penniless. As soon as Wahid finished his hateful commands, the drawings transformed into massive clouds, fierce winds, and destructive storms that roared with a crazed intensity, shaking the earth. However, instead of heading towards his uncle's palace, the clouds, winds, and storms turned and charged towards Wahid's expansive palace. They attacked with great ferocity, unleashing torrential rains that flooded and ruined the gardens and farms. The winds battered the palace walls, splitting them in two, while the storms tore through, ripping off the drapes and decorations, scattering them far and wide. Wahid hurried to seek shelter from the raging storms and threw himself into a well used for his horses' drinking water. When the storm finally subsided, he emerged from the well, only to be horrified by what he saw. His palace was no longer there, nor were his gardens, barns, stables, or farms. The storm had obliterated them all and carried them far away. The land was barren once more, as it had been before, and even his fine clothes and precious jewels had been torn from him and flung far away. Wahid shouted angrily, "Damn you, crazy storm! I will own palaces grander than the ones you destroyed, gardens and barns thousands of times larger, and wealth far greater than what I had before." He began to draw a vast palace on the ground, 1,000 times bigger than his old palace, with extensive barns holding millions of cattle and livestock, gardens stretching to the ends of the earth, and immense wealth piled in vaults, surpassing the riches of Korra. His servants and slaves were countless. However, nothing Wahid drew materialized. The drawings remained lifeless lines and shapes. Wahid lost his mind and realized he had lost the ability to turn his drawings into reality. At that moment, the fairy of good wishes appeared before him. Wahid rushed to her, pleading, "O kind fairy, I have lost my power to turn my drawings into real things. Please restore it to me." The kind fairy shook her head and said, "I promise to grant your wishes as long as you did not misuse them. Good wishes can only come true for good people. You have become arrogant and filled with evil, Wahid. Therefore, you had to lose your ability to make wishes come true because you are no longer good." After saying this, the fairy disappeared. Wahid was stunned, realizing he had lost his magical ability due to his hatred and bitterness. Instead of helping the poor villagers in their hunger, he tormented them and took pleasure in their suffering. Instead of forgiving his uncle and cousins, he sought revenge and destruction. As a result, he lost his great power because hearts filled with hatred and malice cannot succeed or perform good deeds. Wahid returned to his village and his hut, back to being a poor man with nothing but his old hut and tattered clothes. The hut was empty of the jewels and valuables he had left there, likely scattered by the storm. He returned to working as a porter in the village market, struggling with hunger and poverty. When Wahid remembered the blessing granted to him by the kind fairy, he would say to himself with sorrow, "I deserve everything that happened to me because I became an evil person with the blessing given to me. Instead of making people happy with my wealth, I tortured them and sought revenge, remembering their wrongs and forgetting their good deeds." Wahid resumed his old hobby to ease his sorrow, drawing beautiful shapes, horses, knights, clothes embroidered with gold, palaces, mountains, seas with blue skies, people of all races, and distant worlds imagined in his mind. Although his drawings remained mere images, people were captivated by their beauty and detail. News of Wahid's incredible drawings spread far and wide, attracting people from all places and kingdoms. They came to see his marvelous artwork, and soon, they began buying his paintings for large sums of money. In a few months, Wahid became wealthy again. However, he did not leave his village for the city or live in a grand palace. Instead, he used his money to help the villagers, increasing their love for him and his love for them. One day, Princess Al-Baha was passing through the village. Her horse suddenly bolted from her escort, galloping into the village until she managed to control it near Wahid's hut. The princess was astonished by the beautiful lifelike drawings that adorned the hut's walls, unable to contain her admiration. She knocked on the hut's door, and Wahid opened it. Seeing her, he bowed respectfully and said, "A welcome, princess." The princess recognized Wahid immediately and, surprised, said, "You? How is it that you live in such a hut? You once had unimaginable wealth." Wahid replied, "I lost all of it, wise princess, because I did not know how to share it with others. Now, I am just a humble artist trying to bring happiness to people's hearts with my drawings and paintings. I want you to alleviate the burdens of his villagers, who suffer from the fervor of existence and the scarcity of wealth, and to repay debts owed to these people." The princess's eyes filled with admiration, and she said, Indeed, you are a great artist and a noble soul. You have become one with a generous heart, great artistry, and noble deeds. Princess of Splendor is pleased to grant a request from a suitor she had previously declined." Overwhelmed, Walid exclaimed, "Oh, will you accept me as your husband, O princess, even though I possess neither wealth nor riches?" The princess replied, Indeed, within your heart lies a treasure greater than all the world's wealth. It is your love for people and their love for you. Your skilled fingers possess a beautiful artistry bestowed only upon those deemed worthy by God. Thus, you possess rare qualities that few others can match. The princess shall find no better husband than you." At that moment, the princess's guards accepted, escorting the princess and Walid back to the kingdom. Upon learning of his daughter's desire and her consent to marry Walid, the king of the land, the princess's father, was overcome with great joy. Immediately, celebrations were held, and joy spread throughout the kingdom at the union of Walid with the Princess of Splendor. And thank you for listening. If you enjoy stories like this, please let me know in the comments. If you have any feedback, I would be honored to read it.